All right, let's move on to our last session, session 4, an open discussion of moderation and administration of Islam in Malaysia. Now, for this session, our moderator, I will share the background. She is none other than Tan Sri Dr. Asiah Abu Samah. She served in Malaysia's education service for 32 years, from 1961 to 1993 in various capacities. All right, before I continue, can I request those that are not speaking in the front to pay attention, please? Thank you, ma'am, for the kind tap on the glass. All right, our moderator for this session is Tan Sri Dr. Asiah Abu Samah. She served in Malaysia's education service for 32 years from 1961 to 1993 in various capacities as a graduate teacher, lecturer in a training college, principal of a secondary school, director of curriculum. She retired in 1993 as Director General of Education in the Ministry of Education, and after her retirement, she joined Land and General Berhad as the Corporate Advisor to Education. She was with the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, aka SUHAKAM, from 2002 to 2010. Let's invite Tan Sri Asiah Abu Samah to kickstart this forum. Round of applause, please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back. I must congratulate all of you who are still here for your patience, for your loyalty in still being here at this, if I can quote Tan Sri Rafi'ah, graveyard hour. But it's a nice graveyard hour, I think, today. And we were just commenting how nice the tea is. I've been looking for curry puff since the morning. Only just now I found it. This is the last session of the day before the closing by Yang Bagia Tan Sri Alwi. We have 4 panelists by design on the topic of moderation and administration of Islam in Malaysia. For those of you who have kept in touch with the history of formation of G25, you would realize that this is one of the basic reasons why G25 came into being, the issue of moderation in Islam. If you remember the open letter that came out in public sometimes, can't remember the date, early December, I think, 2014, wasn't it? I stand corrected because I was not part of G25 yet then. It so happens that some of us in G25 have been looking at the scenario of administration of Islamic affairs in the country, going into the history of Islamic enactments and the like. We are in the midst of writing our report now, but that we find that there are certain issues that we need further clarification on, pencerahan, as we always say in Bahasa. And I want to thank our 4 panelists for graciously agreeing to be on the panel today and to take up some of these issues. They can't take up all the issues, otherwise we would have to have a panel of 10 people or something like that. Starting with Mr. Aston Paiva. Since he's starting to speak first, I will introduce him first. Mr. Aston is going to speak on the lack of clarity on understanding the precepts of Islam, as well as the overlapping jurisdictions between the civil court and the Sharia court. Am I right? Okay. I think the secretary had already been in touch with panel members and have indicated that I think we give you 10 minutes. Although we are running out of time, but I want to keep the 10 minutes. And I'll find a way, although you're going to speak from up there, I'll give a signal when you get to your 8th minute. I'm addressing all the panelists on this. Then I hope we can have a discussion somewhere between 30 to 40 minutes, because they will touch on the issues, but they will be posing issues to you also based on the issues that they're going to raise. And we hope very much that you will respond. Actively. I participate in the discussion actively. And then I suggest there be no question and answer as such. We will take all your comments, your questions, and then I would invite each of the panelists, depending what time we have. I was just reminded we should stop at 5:45 so that Tan Sri Alwi can give his closing address and we finish by 6 o'clock. So, without further ado, may I invite Aston? I must say a few words about him. Aston spent his formative years in the Victoria Institution in Kuala Lumpur, I'm told. Then he was called, he read law at Cardiff University and was called to the English bar. You're not called to the Malaysian bar, subsequently, okay? Otherwise, how could you practice? Huh? He was called to the English bar as a barrister in the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn in London in 2008. He was admitted as an advocate and solicitor of the High Court of Malaya in 2009, practicing in the area of public and administrative law. Mr. Paiva has represented litigants in judicial reviews, disciplinary proceedings, labor disputes, and constitutional rights cases. He has acted as lead counsel in a number of landmark cases involving the rights of the transgender community and interfaith child custody disputes. He has dedicated a large part of his legal career to helping the vulnerable and marginalized minority communities of Malaysia. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm tasked with talking about two things really, and these are just really misconceptions, because in my line of work, I deal with a lot of different people, politicians, I deal with activists, members of the public, and people like G25, other civil society organizations. And there's a lot of misunderstanding of what actually has been going on in Malaysia in terms of what I call Muslim laws. Politicians refer to them as Sharia laws. There is no such thing as Sharia laws in Malaysia. These are laws for Muslims. The word Sharia was being used because politicians have started planting these words in the enactments. Sharia criminal offenses, Sharia Evidence Act, Sharia Civil Procedure. But the word Sharia itself has never been in our constitution. The first time it made its way into our constitution was in 1976. And even then it was used within a particular context, Sharia court. Before that it was called the Muslim courts. The reason it was called the Muslim courts is because that's how the British understood these courts. And we must remember this, and this is the key issue here. our politicians have time and time again, since the 80s in particular, sought to give this impression that they are doing things for Islam in this country, that they are making these laws, enacting these laws, and concerned about the well-being of Muslims in Malaysia. But that is actually not the case, because Muslim laws in Malaysia have been in Malaysia since more than 100 years. Okay? They were a project, effectively, that the British came to put into place. Now, for those of you all who, I'm sure most of you will be aware here that in 1874, when Perak received its first resident, J.W.W. Birch, they signed the treaty called Pangkor Treaty in 1874. And in that treaty, in clause 6, it actually says, the Sultan shall take the advice of the British advisor on all matters except matters touching the Malay religion and custom. Okay? So that has always been the case. The British never interfered with matters of religion and custom until about 10 or 20 years later, when the Sultan started realizing, being part of their prerogative powers as heads of the religion of Islam, they realized that, we can't do anything. There's no structure at place for us to exercise our power. So that's when, rather paradoxically, the British got involved in this. The British, for the most part, stayed away, but they assisted in making laws for the administration of the language that we use, the administration of Muslim law in Malaysia. So that's how you have all of this Sharia courts, this Tauliah system, this control of religious publication, this Fatwa committee, this Majlis Agama Islam. All of this has been in Malaysia for more than 100 years. And that is a key thing that Malaysians have to understand. This is not something that Kerajaan Barisan Nasional came about. It's always been there. So what I'd like to do right now is just to touch on some of these old laws and just to show you how these laws have never really changed. The kind of disputes that we have today, let me take you through some of them. Sulaiman Takrib. Sulaiman Takrib was a case from Terengganu where a man was arrested for disputing a fatwa. That law has been there since 1952. Fatul Bari was preaching without a tauliah. That law has been there since 1904. More recently, ZI publication, Zaid Ibrahim's son, he was arrested for Muslim offense of publishing religious publication that is contrary to Islamic law. That law has been there since 1938. So why it's important to know all of this is that because now we can assess to see that what is this government of the day doing? Are they abusing the law, or is there a question of this law being unconstitutional? I personally don't think these laws are unconstitutional. I think if you have a reasonable-minded government who exercises power in light of what the law requires, there will be none of these problems. Okay? So now let's just go through this very quickly. Now, those three cases that I mentioned, I'll skip all of them. Let me just take you straight to this 1952 law. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the so this was 1952. This was enacted before Merdeka. So at this point in time, the British were already assisting in putting this into place. Okay, so now some of the sections that you may want to look at. Let's look at the sections I mentioned earlier. First, we have section 172. Whoever by words, spoken or written, or by visible representation insults or brings into contempt or attempts to insult or bring into contempt the Muslim religion or the tenets of any sect thereof, teaching any lawfully authorized religious teacher or any fatwa lawfully issued by the president or under the provisions of this enactment shall be punishable with imprisonment. So this section has always been there. So what they were challenging in Sulaiman Takrib's case was really this. Now, the problem is, now I'll just pause for a minute and explain what the problem is. Our federal court has taken the view that this is an offense against a precept of Islam. That is wrong. And the reason the federal court fell into such an error was because it wasn't looking at these old laws to identify the history of these Muslim laws in Malaysia. So they just assume that these are precept offenses. There's nothing in Islam that tells you that you cannot do this. As far as I'm aware, Islamic legal tradition demands that a fatwa is merely an opinion. You can go to more than one scholar and get an opinion on this matter. So this is not a precept of Islam. This is a law to control, this is a law to determine matters of Islamic law, doctrine, and Malay custom. Fatwas can be issued, official fatwas by the state on matters relating to religious observances, matters relating to doctrines, things of that nature can be made. There's nothing unconstitutional about it, there's nothing illegal about it. So this is not a precept of Islam, we must remember. The other law that we have is section 166, which is religious teaching. This is the Tawliya laws. So whoever, save in his own residence and in the presence of his members of the household, teaches or professes any religious doctrine without the written permission on behalf of the Qadi shall be punishable. The point of this is very simple. It is just to control propagating doctrines and beliefs amongst Muslims. Because in this country, you have a state, every state has a head of the religion of Islam. There must be some body that can control the doctrines that exist. And this is not the case only in Malaysia, it's also the case in England. England also has a state religion, Church of England. It's not Catholicism, it's not Methodist, it's not Calvinism, it's Church of England, it's Anglicanism. So it's just a form of doctrine that is considered the state religion. That's it, it's just a form of religious officialdom. And finally, the last section is section 169, which is the one that Ezra Zaid was caught under. Whoever shall print or publish for sale or free distribution any book or document giving or purporting to give instructions or rulings on any matter of Muslim law, doctrine or Malay custom, shall, if the book contains anything contrary or any lawfully issued fatwa, be punishable with imprisonment. Okay? So now just a quick walk through history before I wrap this up. So now, this is as an example. So this is in 1938. This is a federated Malay state of Negeri Sembilan. So as you can see, even in 1938, there were already offenses already. The attendance at mosques, this is not relevant. Okay, here we go. Kalwat, for instance. Kalwat was first introduced in 1938. Adultery, zina, incest. So this has been here for a long time, So we have to always heed that history has always been here, before we start complaining about things. So section 12 is religious teaching. So they maintained it before 1952, already in 1938, it already existed, religious teaching. No person shall, except in his own house, presence of his members, teach, unless he gets permission from, back then it was His Highness Yang di-Pertuan. That's the head of the religion of Islam in Negeri Sembilan. And 33, you want to be looking at section 14. This is when it was first introduced, publications concerning the Muhammadan religion. You cannot publish matters relating to Islamic law, doctrine and Malay custom that is contrary to the official position taken by the state. We must remember, this has got nothing to do with freedom of expression. This has got everything to do with doctrines and beliefs. Okay? Nothing to do with freedom of expression. If you want to talk about something generally about Islam, you are completely permitted to do that. Otherwise, we can't live in a plural society. We have to be able to talk about each other's religion in a very general sense to explain what it is about. But the line is crossed when you start to propagate the religion. That's the target of this kind of laws. And finally, on this issue, before I move on to the last one, is this. This is how far it goes back. Sorry. So this was the first that I could ever find. This, in fact, was the oldest, 1904. Okay, you will note here of 1904, it was amended subsequently in all of these years. So these were the first set of offenses that the British ever assisted in for the states in Malaysia, called the Muhammadan laws. Okay? And even back then, there was already a Section 9, religious teaching. No person shall, except in his own house, in the presence of members of his own family, teach any religious doctrine. So it's always been here. That's my point. So when we make criticisms of laws like this, we have to always understand what is the context in which these laws are being used and whether is it being abused. In my opinion, I think it is being abused. What happened to Mustafa Akyol? Mustafa Akyol was being charged under this section or investigated under this section. He didn't do anything. He wasn't here to teach anything. He was just here to talk about things, talk about Islam. And let's face it, this is the 21st century. Islam, we must look at Islam in the 21st century. So that's what Mustafa Akyol, as I understand it, was doing here. He was trying to show how the values promoted by Islam can operate in the 21st century world that we live in today. So there's nothing wrong with that. Now, that is offenses. Now we just move on to Sharia court's jurisdiction. This one, very quick. For the longest time, people seem to think there's a lot of confusion about the Sharia court issue, but actually there's none. The real issue here is that the Sharia court has 3 limits to its jurisdiction. It can never cross this, no matter what it does. And the civil courts have affirmed since Deepa Subramaniam's case that is the case. Firstly, territorial. Sharia courts exist within the state. Sharia court in Kota Baru cannot make an order for Labuan or in Sabah. If it does that, the decision is void. Number 2, subject matter. Only Islamic personal law matters only. It cannot start adjudicating over the rights and interests of non-Muslims, or say under the Law Reform Marriage and Divorce Act. So it must be Muslim religious affairs issues and personal law. So that's the second limit of its jurisdiction. Third is subject person, only Muslims. If it decides as against a non-Muslim, as against a public authority, as against a police, it is void. So the federal court in Deepa's case in 2015 has confirmed that these are the 3 limits of the jurisdiction. And if the Sharia court exceeds this jurisdiction, the civil court can make a declaration to that effect. And the civil courts have been making such declarations in recent years. So I will conclude there and take any further questions later on. Thank you very much. Close it.
Thank you, Aston, for well keeping to the time. I hope you have questions, comments to make on what he's just said. Our next panelist is, actually I don't need to introduce her, but I will still do, is Zainah Anwar, who is going to talk to us on gender injustices. Zainah is a founding member and former executive director of Sisters in Islam, or SIS. She is now the executive director of Musawa, the SIS-initiated global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. She also writes a monthly column, Sharing the Nation, in the Star newspaper. Zainah is the author of Legacy of Honor on 3 generations of political leadership in Malaysia. Her book, Islamic Revivalism in Malaysia, Da'wah Among the Students, has become a standard reference in the study of Islam in Malaysia. She was educated at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University and Boston University in the USA, and the Mara Institute of Technology in Malaysia in the fields of international relations and journalism. I present to you. Thank you. Zainah.
Yeah, quickly, because time is running out, I want to focus on 2 issues. One, two subjects. One at the issues level, the law, legal level, and the other one at the process level in terms of administration of Islam with regards to women's rights. And of course, I feel like I'm repeating myself again and again. I guess my big beef in terms of the administration of Islam in this country is, why is it that Muslims themselves allow fellow Muslims to be discriminated against in the name of Islam? And I'm talking about Muslim women, Muslim men, Muslims in authority, allowing the use and abuse of Islam to justify discrimination against women. And what is most frustrating is that since the 1990s onwards, when Malaysia became, gripped by political Islam, these rounds of law reform on Islamic laws have led to further discrimination against women. At the same time, rounds of law reform for non-Muslims have led to equality between non-Muslim men and non-Muslim women. What kind of a country is this, where one set of laws move towards equality between the two genders, and another set of laws, in the name of religion, move towards further inequality, even though the facts on the ground, the reality on the ground, is completely the opposite, yeah? That women are moving forward in terms of education, roles that they play, responsibilities that they play, financial independence and all that. So I'm proposing that at the legal level, it's really high time that there is a comprehensive reform of the Islamic family law. In the past, it's always been, reforms, a little bit here, a little bit there, patchwork reform. But the legal framework of the Muslim family law in this country remains a legal framework that recognizes men as being superior to women, as having authority over women, as being in charge of women. This is a discriminatory legal framework that is totally disconnected with the realities on the ground. So men are regarded as the providers and protectors of women and children and of the family. But the reality is that not all men are providers and protectors. In today's world, in today's economy, women as well, by necessity, are providers and protectors of the family. Women's income, families cannot survive on a single income today. So women are working out there, whether formal or informally, to contribute to family well-being. So they are the provider of the family. And many women, female-headed households, whether it's death, divorce, abandonment, polygamy, where women are effectively the provider and the protector, the sole provider and protector of the family, is a huge issue. And yet the laws have not recognize these changes that's taking place on the ground. And whenever women's groups demand for law reform, we are told our demands for law reform are against Islam, against God, against Sharia. Just silence the debate and silence the search for solution to all these problems that have just been going on for decades. The Malaysian government recognized as long ago as 1976 there must be equality between men and women, but only for non-Muslims. So the Law Reform, Marriage and Divorce Act was amended to recognize equality and abolish all forms of discrimination against women. And yet, I don't know how many years later now, it can unashamedly say, in the name of Islam, Muslim women should continue to be discriminated against. And this is really disgraceful. Yeah? Instead of moving forward, the 2 rounds of law reform in 1994 and then in the 2000s, the 2 rounds of law reform to the Islamic family law, just regression for women. Yeah? And the second, that's a family law. It's a long-standing issue that Sisters in Islam has been dealing with, and it's really high time that we really call for a comprehensive reform of the family law. The second issue I want to call is, I'm not even calling for law reform, I want us to start a conversation, a public conversation on the whole issue of the division of inheritance that discriminates against women. Again, for non-Muslim, Distribution Act was amended in 1999 to recognize equal right to inheritance between men and women. But of course, in the name of Islam, no, that cannot be extended to Muslim women. Muslim women will continue to be discriminated against. And of course, the Muslim Fara'id rules, the wife inherits half of what the husbands are entitled to, and daughters inherit half of what sons are entitled to. But the Fara'id division also recognized the parents of the deceased as equals. The father and the mother inherit equally. So obviously, in certain circumstances, Islamic law does recognize equality. So under what circumstances then can this Fara'id division, which discriminates against the wife and against the daughters, Under what circumstances that debate has to begin, can that be reviewed to recognize equality and justice for women? The fact is, we know many families today undertake all kinds of arrangements, whether it is through trust, through wasiat, through hibah, all kinds of methods of distribution in order to protect the interests of their loved ones as they see fit, rather than through the Farid rules, which means there is already recognition on the ground, the reality on the ground, that these rules that discriminate against wives and daughters do not work in their best interests. And this debate has begun in Tunisia and Morocco. The debate has begun on the discrimination against women in inheritance. Groups have done research on the impact of this discrimination on women's well-being, and research now is being developed. How do we justify the ability to reform these understandings of inheritance rules that discriminate against women? Should men continue to be privileged? These are questions women are asking, but in private. At funerals, you hear this discussion. Just today, I had this discussion. Should men continue to be privileged when women not only are primarily responsible for the family emotional and physical well-being, but also its financial survival? Should Baitul Mal take a share of the inheritance when there are no male heirs? So families without sons are discriminated against. Should uncles, brothers of the deceased inherit a share when there are 8 daughters in the family to be fed and taken care of? Should families be discriminated against because there is no son? Should the marital home be sold and the proceeds divided according to Farid, and the widow and children left without a roof over their heads? Should the daughter, who usually takes care of the aging parents until they die, get half the share of inheritance, while the son, who has done nothing to take care emotionally, financially, physically of the aging parents, come home in his Mercedes and demands his double share? You know, these are such gross injustices that are taking place on the ground, and we need to start a conversation and to discuss how do we deal. Is this the intent of Islam and Islamic law? I don't think it is, because Islamic law is supposed to bring about justice. In Singapore, already reform has taken place. Families without sons can apply to Baitul Mal for the widows and daughters to keep the full inheritance. And Baitul Mal, as a matter of course, waives its share, in order to do justice. The marital home also cannot be sold and be divided according to Farid rule. And if you have no son, that means, it's usually the uncles, of families without sons who go after these marital homes because they want their share of the inheritance. And I'm not even sure whether, how many of you Muslims in this hall today are even aware that the nominees you name as your beneficiaries in your insurance policy or your EPF account actually only act as administrators upon your death. Just pray no one in your family, extended family, will challenge your wishes, because if they do, those monies in EPF and insurance will actually be divided according to Farid. So the problem that we're facing is not just the substantive provisions in the laws that discriminate against women and that cause injustice. The problem is also with the way laws and decisions are made in the name of Islam. The issue of authority. Who has the right? Who has the authority to speak on Islam? Whenever groups like Sisters in Islam or G25 speak out, and our points of views are different from the mainstream religious thinking, we are told to shut up. We're told we're deviants. We're against Islam. We have no right to question. And this is hurled. This accusation has been hurled at SIS since the day we began. That's like 30 years ago. Can we move on? It's like a broken record trying to delegitimize your voice and shut you up and silence dissenting voices. And as I've said again and again, in a country where Islam is used as a source of law, public policy and practice, everyone has a right to speak out on how these laws and practices affect them, how they are understood, how they are codified, especially when they cause harm, pain and injustice. Women are no longer willing to just roll over and keep silent over this. Why is it that when the government decided to reform the Discriminatory Marriage and Divorce Act governing non-Muslims, a parliamentary select committee, this morning we talked about that, a parliamentary select committee was formed. It traveled to all parts of the country to take in submissions from experts, from various groups, stakeholders. It reviewed all the submissions and then drafted a law that ended discrimination against women and granted women and men equal right to marry and equal right to divorce. But when the Muslim family law, which in 1984 was regarded as one of the most progressive personal status laws in the Muslim world, went through 2 rounds of amendments only to make it worse for women, there was no consultation. The reform process was done without any women's groups being involved, let alone benefit from a select committee that traveled all over the country to hear voices from the ground. Why? Is it because the men in authority are too afraid to hear the realities on the ground, and that this means their rights and privileges might be questioned and challenged and eventually be changed? It is, of course, very convenient then to shout out, "This is God's law that cannot be questioned," to silence the dissenting voices. But we all know, and please, this, I think what Ashton said is important, there are differences between what is Sharia, what is fiqh, jurisprudence, what is state law. But everything is mulled and combined into one. It's Sharia, it's divine, it's God's law, it's God's words that cannot be challenged. These are not God's words. These are man-made words, man-made understanding, man-made codification of the law, and it is men, mostly men, who sit in parliament and pass the law, and it is men who are implementing the law. These are all human beings, they are not God. So we have the right to question, to challenge, to demand that change must take place. It is obvious, for all of us to see that change is indeed galloping before our very eyes. But those in religious authority are totally and willfully, it's willful refusal to recognize this change, yeah? In the end, we must ask the question, what is the purpose of Islamic law in this country? To maintain male privilege? To do harm to women, because that's what is happening, and family well-being? Or to bring about justice and compassion? Much research has been done, reports submitted to reform discriminatory Islamic law. Rounds of negotiations have been held in the government. This seems like a broken record. This morning we also talk about all these, all kinds of proposals and committees being set, but nothing happens. Yeah? The last round of negotiation over the Islamic family law was in 2006 with the then Attorney General to deal with the gross amendments made that further discriminated against women. We reached a compromise with the AG. And the bill was, we were not happy, but we were willing to compromise. And the bill was submitted to Parliament, only to be withdrawn. 11 years ago, 11 years have passed, and nothing has moved forward. In the meantime, Morocco has reformed its family law to recognize marriage as a partnership of equals. So has Turkey, so has Tunisia, so has Algeria. Turkey, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan recognize that a woman can marry without a wali, but not Malaysia. These are all Muslim countries using Islam as a basis for reform. Minimum age of marriage. Many Muslim countries have minimum age of marriage at 18 for both boys and girls, not in Malaysia. Many countries have banned polygamy. Tunisia, Turkey, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Many more countries have all made polygamy a ground for divorce. Here, women's groups have to advise women, when you're here before the court and you want a divorce, don't ever tell the judge it's because your husband has committed polygamy and you're unhappy and you want a divorce. You better use some other reason, because polygamy is not recognized as a grounds for divorce. You get the drift. This is not divine law. Yeah? It's man-made law. Thus, the diversity of laws in different Muslim countries that exist, then they can change to recognize changing times and circumstances so that the eternal justice of Islam and the objective of Sharia law to bring about justice is the outcome of the law reform process. So I really feel that it's time that this government and all of us first acknowledge the structural roots of inequality in Muslim family laws and recognize that diversity of opinions and juristic concepts exist within the Muslim legal tradition that those in authority have conveniently pushed aside and forgotten, that these concepts, very sophisticated legal concepts of differences of opinion, of public interest, of choosing the best opinion to serve the public good, all these legal concepts from classical Islam that we should be proud of, all these concepts can be used to push for reform. Second, do please examine new groundbreaking scholarship that reconciles Islam with women's rights, Islam and human rights that already exists, and consider the efforts of other countries where progressive law reform is already taking place, has taken place in all these Muslim countries that recognize equality between men and women. Third, engage in a consultative process towards law reform with civil society groups and individuals working on gender equality and family law to ensure that the daily realities of those most affected by these discriminatory laws and practices are urgently addressed. Lastly, I want to suggest that we form an interagency committee. Government forms an interagency committee of women's groups, including women's groups. They did this with the Domestic Violence Act. They've done this with the Child Act. Let's do it for the Islamic family law to discuss and review the Islamic family law and work towards comprehensive reform within a legal framework that recognizes marriage as a partnership of equals, that will promote and protect the well-being of all members of the family. Second, establish a select committee on Sharia legislation, on Muslim law legislation in Parliament and state legislative assemblies, and such committee can appoint outside experts and call on members of the public and civil society to testify and comment on any proposed legislation. This will democratize the lawmaking process in this country. Lawmaking in the name of Islam cannot be the exclusive preserve of 8, 9, 10 men sitting together to decide this is what Islam says, this is not Islam, this is Islam. There has to be a democratic process, and the lived realities of Muslims in this country have to be taken into consideration. So obviously, third, I want to suggest that we need a gender sensitization training for judges, court officials, and officials from JAKIM and the state religious affairs departments, given that 60 to 70% of the cases they manage are actually family matters that involve women. So they need to be aware and to be sensitive of the realities of women's lives today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zainah. Zainah at her most eloquent. I needn't say anything further. Just hope that you will not let what she said go past. I hope many of you will comment or ask her further about what she just said. Thank you. Our third panelist is Professor Dr. Syed Farid Alatas, who will speak on how extremism and sectarianism influence the administration of Islam. Professor Dr. Syed Farid is Professor of Sociology at the University of Singapore. He also headed the Department of Malay Studies at NUS from 2007 till 2013. He lectured at the University of Malaya before that in the Department of Southeast Asian Studies. Professor Alatas has authored numerous books and articles, including on Ibn Khaldun, the recovery of lost tradition in sociology, also concerning Ibn Khaldun, then on sociological theory beyond the canon, working together with Benita Sinha, the state of feminist theory in Malaysia, in Maznah Muhammad and Wong publication by them. Then on Feminism, Malaysian Reflections and Experience. His area of interest are the sociology of Islam, social theory, religion and reform, intra- and inter-religious dialogue, and the study of Orientalism. He's already up there. Please have the floor.
Thank you.
Professor Farid.
Assalamu alaikum and salam sejahtera. So I'm talking about sectarianism. But I want to stress before I make my points that talking about sectarianism in connection with Islam, and about the administration of Islam in connection with sectarianism, it's not just about the situation of minority Muslims, of the minorities among Muslims in Malaysia. It's also a reflection of how Islam is dealt with at the administrative level, at the level of government, and the religious departments. So it's not, while we can take the way certain sects, Muslim sects are treated in Malaysia as case studies, but they are case studies of how Islam in general is administered. So it affects all of us, not just specific Muslim minorities. I have about seven points. Now the first, I'm going to say ABC because I put them down as ABC, and if I use 1, 2, 3, I will lose count. So A, the nature of the problem. It's not such that we do not know what to do about the problem, right? So I want to suggest that, let me put it this way. We do know what should be done when it comes to sectarianism in Malaysia. But the problem is that we're not able to persuade those who are in power to bring about the necessary changes. And the problem exists at 3 levels, at least 3 levels. First of all, you have exclusivism on the part of religious authorities, and it is gradually growing among the Rakyat. Secondly, you have a political elite that supports administratively supports this exclusivism. And thirdly, you have an apathetic population that fails to put pressure on the elite to bring about the necessary changes. So I think the problems exist at these 3 levels. Now, when I said exclusivism, I'm referring specifically to a kind of exclusivism that we can call sectarianism, which refers to a kind of bigotry or hatred towards groups that are different from you. Let's just put it that way. You have different groups in a society within a particular religious community, let's say, Muslims, and the very existence of differences or the very existence of different groups doesn't mean that you have sectarianism. But when you attach superiority or inferiority to the different groups, and there is the accompanying bigotry or hatred, then you get sectarianism. So this is essentially the problem. So the next point, the manifestation of this sectarianism, of course, in Malaysia, giving the example of the way we treat Shiites, is actually persecution. And we have distinguished ourselves, Malaysia has distinguished itself among the nations of Islam, the Muslim countries of the world, by actively persecuting Shiites, which is actually something quite rare. In other countries, such as in Pakistan, in Iraq, in several other countries, you do have sectarianism and sectarian strife without the governments actually legally sanctioning, condoning persecution. So in Pakistan, for example, you have even physical violence between Sunnis and Shiites, but not the legal condoning of persecution of Shiites. What you have in Malaysia, it hasn't reached the level of physical conflict, but you actually have legal persecution, and I think you all know, I don't have time to go through the examples, but we have several cases of arrests, detention, of raids and arrests of Muslims because they are or are thought to be Shiites. Now the thinking behind this is chaotic. The thinking behind this is that if you have groups that are different from each other, there will be conflict in society, and therefore there will be a security problem. It's a ridiculous kind of thinking, because the logic is that, therefore, in order to avert conflict, we have to get rid of one of those groups, obviously the minority group. This is the way they think about it. Not realizing that the only solution has to be to bring about peace and harmony between these groups, rather than getting rid of one group. Because if you think along the lines of, those lines, you will forever have to get rid of groups. First, it's the Shiites. Then among the Sunnis, there are also different groups. Already there's some hostility in this country towards Sufism, even in official circles. And Sufis are Sunnis. Then you get rid of them. And it never ends. You get on a slippery slope. Now, my next point is this. I think this is the fourth point. The exclusivism is, the sectarianism, the exclusivism is, the way I'm using it, I'm defining it as such, not from the point of view of liberal or modern values, but from Islamic tradition. Because it is not part of Sunni tradition to have this sectarian attitude towards other minority groups or sects within Islam. I also want to stress here that we are talking about the administration of Islam, but at least as far as sectarianism is concerned, I think the problem is less an administrative issue and more a moral problem. It has to do not so much with legal procedures or the bureaucratization of Islam, but more the moral problem of the presence of sectarian attitude. Now, we of course have to talk about what can be done. What can be done? I think that I would like to maybe talk about two areas. One is, and this we've not talked about because this issue has not perhaps been relevant for the earlier discussions, the role of the rulers. We have to realize that many of the fatwas passed against Shiites, against Shiism in this country, have become law because they were gazetted, with the approval, of course, or through the instrumentality of the rulers. So we have to realize that the rulers actually do have a very important role to play in the promulgation of Islamic law and in the implementation of Islamic law, and that in many areas of administration of Islamic law, we would like to see, I would like to see a greater role of the rulers in rolling back some of these restrictions or some of these Sharia enactments and laws which are problematic. And here, of course, I'm speaking specifically about sectarianism. We have seen in some cases, the Sultan of Johor has weighed in on some of the discussions, but the Constitution, it seems to me, allows for a far greater role of the rulers in the administration of Islamic law than they are actually playing. And I think there is an important role that we have to play in terms of urging the rulers to play a greater role in and having a greater say in a way that allows for a more progressive expression of Islam. Now, this brings me to the next point, the role of civil society. In a sense, you know, I think we deserve the government that we have. We deserve the kind of the form of Islam or the interpretation of Islam that is being administered to us. Why am I saying that? When it comes to the issue of sectarianism, when it comes to the issue of persecution of Shiites, there's no outrage in Muslim society. Yet Muslims are complaining about other aspects of, of governance, poor governance. They're complaining about, other areas of Muslim life controlled by, they're complaining of other areas of life where they're controlled, whether it concerns Muslims or not. But when it comes to the issue of sectarianism, the Muslim majority is almost totally silent, with the exception of a handful of people, less than a handful of people. But there's total silence. These raids of Shiite places of Shiite, congregations, arrests, and other forms of harassment have been taking place for years and happening every year. But there are hardly any. There are some, a handful of lay Muslim scholars and activists who are vocal against this. There are hardly any Muslim scholars, traditional Muslim scholars, or ulama, who are vocal about this. So I think, and there's no precedence in Islamic tradition for banning or banning the existence of groups that are outside of the mainstream. Even in the case of groups or individuals who express dissenting views or who are guilty of, certain crimes, certain sort of moral crimes, such as slander, insults, and so on and so forth. Even in such cases, in Islamic tradition, if you are guilty of slander, you're guilty of insult and other, other moral crimes, dissenting views, dissent against fatwas, for example, that are accepted by the majority. Even in such cases, the jurists generally understood that there is no legal process or procedure against such people. Rather, the way is through moral persuasion, it is through advice, and so on and so forth. And there's no such thing in Islamic law as collective punishment. So if you have a member of a Shiite, if a particular Shiite is guilty of a certain transgression, then the punishment is against him, but not against the whole community. And that applies to Sunnis as well, right? So the whole idea of of a certain religious community, a sect within Islam, not being allowed to exist within the larger Muslim community has no precedence in Islamic history. Therefore, what the religious authorities are doing, and the hate speech that is being circulated, whether on social media or in mosques during Friday sermons and so on, is really very much a product of modern Islamist movements and not Islamic tradition. So I just want to, to end by saying that we have been allowing this demonization of Shiites and hate speech to go on for years, spearheaded by certain groups, spearheaded by certain individuals. Some of them are part of the religious authorities in this country. Some of them are, are freelance so-called ulama. Some of them are university lecturers and professors. These people are extremely irresponsible people. Extremely irresponsible. Why? Because it is generally irresponsible behavior to engage in hate speech and demonization, but it is also a matter of life and death. In Singapore last year, a couple, I think at least 2 people were arrested for planning to go to join ISIS, to go to Syria to join ISIS. Now, they had said that one of their goals was to kill Shiites, because Shiites are infidels, they're not Muslims. Now, to the extent that these people are influenced by the hate speech and the demonization of Shiites, and this has encouraged them to go and kill Shiites, it is extremely irresponsible to allow this to go on. But it goes on. And I blame the Muslim majority for being silent and not expressing outrage against this. Our government will change its tune, will sing a different song if they know that the majority of Muslims in this country do not buy and do not condone demonization of minorities among Muslims, demonization of Shiites and even other groups. They will change. But as long as the Muslim majority is silent, then I don't see any hope. So to me, at least as far as sectarianism is concerned, as far as anti-Shiism in this country is concerned, taking anti-Shiism as the example, the problem is not so much the administration of Islam, but rather the failure of the majority to exert sufficient pressure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Syed Farid. He has challenged us, I think. We are, those of us who have not said anything about this bigotry and hatred, I think to me it's an indictment on us why we kept quiet. So you may want to react to that during discussion time. Thank you. Our last but not least speaker is, again, doesn't need introduction, Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, who's going to speak to us on deviation from the values and principles of the Constitution and the marginalization and neglect of the Rukun Negara. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, as many of you are aware, is the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the One Malaysia Foundation, an independent non-profit organization established in July 2009 dedicated to the One Malaysia vision, guided by the Malaysian Constitution. Dr. Chandra is also the president of the International Movement for a Just World, or JUST. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. The author and editor of 31 books in English and Malay, many of his writings have been translated into other languages. Dr. Chandra's latest publication is an e-book entitled Critical Concerns from East to West. Preceding it are 3 other e-books, The Long Journey to Human Dignity and Global Justice, Wither Wana, Reflections on the Arab Uprisings and a World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? In 1977, he founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Aliran Kesedaran Negara, or Aliran, which he led for 14 years. Today, apart from his role in JUST, Dr. Chandra sits on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Dr. Chandra is also the recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and social activism. Dr. Chandra, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tan Sri, fellow panelists, friends, Assalamu alaikum, salam sejahtera, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking G25 for this very kind invitation. I will first look at the Constitution very quickly, and then at the Rukun Negara. There have been deviations from the Constitution, which we are all aware of, which is why it has been amended a number of times. Many of these deviations relate to democracy, including elections, and attempts to amend the Constitution have most of the time sought to strengthen executive power. But I don't regard these deviations as the most fundamental challenge confronting us as far as the Constitution is concerned. I think the greatest failing in relation to the Constitution since Merdeka has been our inability to socialize the Malaysian nation into the Constitution. That has been our greatest failure. We established a Constitution which, to all intents and purposes, is a fine document. It's a balanced document, taking into account the history, the evolution of the country, the contemporary situation, individual rights, community interests, a Constitution that takes into account both freedom and order. It's remarkable in many ways. But what we failed to do right from the beginning was to socialize the nation into the Constitution. What does one mean by this? We failed to get Malaysians in all walks of life to really appreciate this Constitution. The concept of balance in the Constitution and what it really means, how it integrates history and the contemporary situation, for instance. Because if you look at the Constitution, you would not argue, as some Malaysian intellectuals have argued, that when you look at ethnic relations, you just look at the situation confronting us today, the current landscape, and then you will be able to come up with solutions. This shows a tremendous degree of ignorance. You cannot understand ethnic relations without understanding the history of this country. This nation did not come out of the ocean all of a sudden. It has got a history behind it. The very federation that we have of different states is a product of Malay polities, of Malay states. That is at the core of this nation. And one has to recognize this because that explains the sultanates. It explains the Malay language. It explains the position of Islam. It explains special position in the Constitution. It explains even something very specific in the Constitution in relation to the Malay regiment. So one has to understand the history of this country, which very often we ignore whenever we talk about national unity. This is why that knowledge of the Constitution in the real sense, really understanding, imbibing the Constitution is so vital, and we have failed utterly in achieving this. You know, the first person who made me aware of this when I was an undergraduate at the University of Singapore was actually Professor Wong Ganggu, one of our greatest historians. He is the one who, in fact, said this openly in a forum at the University of Singapore a few months after May 13th. This, he said, is the real cause of May 13th, the utter failure to understand what the nation is, which is why there were certain emotions that were stirred up and certain actions and reactions took place that led to the May 13th riot. So this, I think, is very important as far as our Constitution is concerned. But our greater failure is in relation to the Rukun Negara, greater than our failure in relation to the Constitution. Here again, a very good document. A document that is the product, like in the case of the Constitution, a product of consultation. 69 individuals came together after the May 13th riot from different communities, different walks of life, under the chairmanship of Tun Razak, who was then the Deputy Prime Minister. And they forged the Rukun Negara. 5 principles, 5 goals. Right from the beginning, we never really paid much attention to the Rukun Negara, though in the 70s there was some attention to it, to the principles at least, and now and then to the goals. But many of us don't even know that the Rukun Negara comprises 5 principles and 5 aspirations. It is not just 5 principles. This is what the Rukun Negara is. And the aspirations are very important because the principles are linked to the aspirations. The principles are there to enable us to journey towards those aspirations. That's what the Rukun Negara said in its commentary right at the outset. But we have neglected this. How did this happen? As I said a while ago, 70s, some attention. But the neglect began from the 80s. Mind you, this is a document that was presented to the nation on the 31st of August 1970 as the nation's philosophy, its ideology, by the 4th Young Diprotanago. And then, after a few years, total neglect, marginalization of the Rukun Negara, which is just amazing. It is just another example of Malaysia Boleh, the sort of things that we do in this country. Here you have a national philosophy, you just neglect it after that. You marginalize it. Why did that happen from the 1980s onwards? 5 interrelated reasons why this happened, which have never really been discussed in detail in public because it's quite sensitive. Why this had happened. The first reason, it's related to political leadership. After Dr. Mahathir Mohamad took over as Prime Minister, he deliberately ignored the Rukun Negara for reasons which are not really known to the general public. But there isn't a single speech that Dr. Mahathir had made, an important speech, where he paid obeisance to the Rukun Negara, where he emphasized the importance of the Rukun Negara. There's not a single speech. One can guess what the reasons were, why he did not pay much attention to the Rukun Negara. I think part of the reason is, and I'm just guessing this as a student of politics, by looking at a person's actions and his politics. I think part of the reason is that deep down Dr. Mahathir had a certain ideological understanding of what this nation should become. And it was influenced to some extent by his understanding, his perception of what Islam should be and the role it should play in Malaysian society. Which is why you had the Islamic University, after he became Prime Minister, Islamic Bank, Islamic Insurance, why he brought in a young Islamicist, Anwar Ibrahim, to strengthen his leadership, because I think he had a certain notion which was colored to a great extent by Mahathir's attraction to capitalism, a capitalistic notion of Islam, hard work. True, Islam emphasizes work. He wanted some notion of Islam, which is why he did not want the Rukun Negara in the way of that pursuit of his. But maybe there was another reason, a more important reason. The Rukun Negara, as I said a while ago, was the product of the National Consultative Council headed by Tun Razak. But the subcommittee that drafted the Rukun Negara was headed by Tan Sri Ghazali Shafi'i, the late Tan Sri Ghazali Shafi'i. And I think it was partly the rivalry between Dr. Mahathir and Tan Sri Ghazali Shafi'i, why he set aside the Rukun Negara. It was how he felt about Ghazali Shafi'i and how Ghazali Shafi'i felt about him. You know, that rivalry, for those of us who know the politics of that period, it is something that was real. Don't forget that just before Mahathir became Prime Minister, as Deputy Prime Minister, his political secretary was arrested under the ISA. And the person who arrested him was the then Minister of Home Affairs, Ghazali Shafi. So there was rivalry, and I think he saw this as a way of setting aside Ghazali Shafi and his contribution, ignored the Rukn Negara, which is a great tragedy. This was a national philosophy. You don't allow individual proclivities, how you feel about people, your inclinations to interfere with something as major as this. And when he took over, as I said a while ago, he brought in Anwar. Anwar Ibrahim, again, you look at all his speeches as minister in different capacities and then deputy prime minister, again, he had never paid any attention to the Rukn Negara. Because I think Anwar also had a certain ideological bent. Anwar was committed to a certain view of Islam that he wanted to strengthen. It may have been influenced from what I know of his writings, of his politics, and of him as a person, because a very, very close friend of mine in the early years. A sort of Jamaat Islami, Muslim Brotherhood notion of Islam. And again, he would have felt the Rukn Negara is a barrier. You cannot have this ideology if you're going to push for that sort of Islamic order. He never used the term Islamic State, to be fair to him, after he joined the government, but undoubtedly a certain notion of Islam that he wanted to pursue. Linked to that, a second factor. From the late 70s, 80s onwards, Malay political culture was beginning to change for a variety of reasons. But the end product of the change was a greater adherence within the Malay masses. It's not just leadership, mind you, within the Malay masses to a certain notion of Islam, shaped by the way Islam had been understood for ages, largely form rather than substance, symbol rather than content, but a notion of Islam which wanted a projection of the religion. And that is what had happened from the 80s onwards. This is partly because of what was happening within the Muslim masses, which is why, when you come to think about it, partly because of rapid urbanization that took place from the 70s and 80s onwards, Malays becoming part of the urban setting in a massive way, a tremendous transformation that was taking place in the landscape, and Malays for the first time becoming very conscious of their identity in their own land. And they became conscious of that identity in urban Malaysia rather than in rural Malaysia, which makes sense because urban Malaysia was largely non-Malay and non-Muslim. They became conscious of the need to project their identity, to protect their identity. So this is how an Islamic ethos began to develop. Within that Islamic ethos, the Rukn Negara, if you look at its 5 aspirations, unity, justice, democracy, liberal society, progressive society, somehow it did not fit in. So this change that was taking place was really fundamental. If you want to look for an expression of that change, you know the way in which the hijab became so pervasive within the Muslim community in this country compared to Muslim communities elsewhere. You can go to Muslim-majority countries like Egypt or Turkey. The hijab did not become as pervasive in such a short while as in this country, right from the 80s onwards. So much so that today those women who don't wear the hijab are really a minority in this country. Now that is an example of a certain notion of Islam that is getting very, very strong. And that is related to the point that I just made, that somehow it did not sit well with the 5 principles and the 5 goals. So the Rukn Negara was seen as something that was a bit troublesome. They began to feel uneasy about it, but you cannot jettison it. You cannot abandon it because it is a national philosophy associated with, well, undoubtedly, the most revered leader among the Malays, Tun Razak. You just can't push it aside. So they kept it there, lingering on the margins of society, but not given much significance because it didn't synchronize with the changes that were taking place in the way in which Malay society saw itself. For the non-Malays, an important component of the nation, and the Rukun Negara was meant for everyone. It is universal, it is inclusive. You would have thought that the non-Malays would have rallied around the Rukun Negara, but they didn't either. They didn't either. They didn't really see the Rukun Negara as something that was so vital, so critical for the future of the nation. Why? There's a reason for that. If you look at the Rukun Negara, principles universal, inclusive, but there is nothing which, for a lot of Malays, given their orientation in politics, for a lot of Malays, there wasn't something that was very concrete that they could identify with in the Rukun Negara. Unlike even the Constitution, where you had Article 152 about their right to use their own language and study their own language, or an article on their right to use and practice their own religion, these things were concrete. But there was nothing concrete in the Rukun Negara. And if you look at non-Malay politics, they were always gravitated towards issues and concerns that are concrete in terms of their ethnic interests. This is a fact. I'm being very, very candid, as I've always been. So when there is nothing that is very concrete in terms of their own ethnic interests, the way in which they project their own ethnic interests, they don't warm up to it, which is why the Rukun Negara is something that didn't attract them, which I think is a great pity. It is a great pity. So the Rukun Negara was not given much attention. And the other reason, the final reason, is because in 1991, February 1991, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad comes out with Wawasan 2020. Indirectly, it was a way of sidelining the Rukun Negara. Again, friends, look carefully at Wawasan 2020. 9 strategic challenges. You know, 5 out of the 9 challenges are actually related to the Rukun Negara. It's simply because one did not want to use the Rukun Negara because of its association and because of how he felt about it. He wanted to come out with something that was his own, which would be seen as his mark in Malaysian history. And I was just joking with my dear friend Farid just now that if he returns as Prime Minister, he would have achieved something really wonderful, because 2020, he may still be Prime Minister. And that would be something really amazing, wouldn't it? Right? Suddenly, 2020, and you know, the vision that he had articulated, and he's there. He himself would not have thought that this was going to happen, but it may happen. God bless him. But the point I'm making is that Wawasan 2020 also sidelined the Rukun Negara. 5 years after Wawasan 2020 was enunciated, in 1996, there was a very big meeting, and a very important one, to review the implementation of Wawasan 2020, which was a good idea. But there has never been a single conference on the part of the government to look at the Rukun Negara and its implementation and what has been accomplished, because there was no interest in it. And this is the situation that confronted us when we decided, Zainah, myself, and 5 others, that we should revive the Rukun Negara after it had been pushed to the margins. Of course, I must say, in all fairness to Tun Abdullah Badawi, he tried to revive the Rukun Negara in 2005. He made a couple of attempts, but the environment had changed so much. And in the end, he fell back upon Islam Hadari because the Islamic ethos had taken over. But he did try to give some emphasis to the Rukun Negara. And we thought, as citizens, ordinary citizens, that we should emphasize the Rukun Negara for a very, very important reason. And this is what I want to share with you in the conclusion of my discussion. Because when we look at what's happening to the country, we are moving in a certain direction. And the direction we would move into, and some of the signs are very, very visible, that direction is going to be determined by those who have political power, those who have the emotional force, the emotional potency of the masses behind them. And that direction is obviously being shaped by a certain idea of Islam. People who are campaigning for a type of Islamic order, Islamic state, call it what you will. There are in fact people saying that Article 3 in the Malaysian Constitution about Islam as the religion of the Federation, that's enough to promote this idea of an Islamic order that they want. It's being done from inside government, it's being done from outside government. And that push, I think, is quite strong. And when I compare Malaysia to many other societies, including our neighbor, I do not think that we have the forces that can resist this. We do not have the forces that can resist this. Forces that have got the political power and that emotional power to resist this. This is not Indonesia, friends. In Indonesia, the big difference is this. They came up with a national philosophy right at the time of the birth of the Indonesian nation state in 1945. The Pancasila is part of the constitution, as you know, and it was projected as the philosophy, 5 principles, defining the Indonesian state. Indonesia has changed so much since 1945 in terms of leaders, types of government, forms of governance, but the Pancasila has remained. This is very, very significant. The Pancasila has remained. And no leader, after Sukarno, who was associated with the Pancasila, Suharto, he did not change the Pancasila. And after Suharto, you had Habibie, you had Gus Dur, you had Megawati, you had all these leaders, but not one of them said, we are setting aside the Pancasila. There's an attachment, a very deep attachment to the Pancasila, which is why just last year, the Indonesian President Jokowi would say openly that he is the Pancasila, that this is the darah daging of the Indonesian leadership, a total commitment to the Pancasila, against some of the narrow extremist forces, which are also becoming quite vocal in Indonesia. But they will always be held at bay, because in Indonesia there is a certain ethos that has developed, that has become stronger and stronger. It is there. We don't have that in Malaysia. We must understand this. Which is why we thought that bringing back a national philosophy that's already there, which has its weaknesses, there's no doubt about it. No document is perfect, but it is a good document, the Rukun Negara. This is one way of checking this trend. And we were hoping for more support from the Malaysian people, but it was not forthcoming. We tried to get signatures, it was not forthcoming. We had a few hundred signatures. We were hoping that people would write articles, speak about this. The response was lukewarm. And it is sad. This is the reality of this society, the way in which we respond to situations. We sometimes respond to things that are very, very immediate, and somehow it touches an emotional chord in us, and we react, we erupt. But things that require that sort of long-term thinking, reflection, you find that we don't really act. But nonetheless, I'm glad, and I want to put this on record, I'm glad that there's been some positive response from the Conference of Rulers, And it was mainly through communication, interaction with His Royal Highness the Sultan of Perak, who saw the value, the importance of this, and has given it a lot of support. So much so that on the 10th of October, 2017, last year, the Conference of Rulers came out with a statement where it urged the Malaysian nation to hold on to the Rukun Negara as the guiding compass of the nation. Pedoman compass pedoman for the nation, which I think is very significant. Just 3 weeks ago, the ruler of Negeri Sembilan made a very good speech where he talked about the Rukun Negara and its significance to the nation. So there are, I think, individuals of that sort, and this gives me some hope that we would be able to strengthen this stream of consciousness, because it's nothing more than a stream. It's a small stream. where we want to hold on to certain inclusive, universal principles. We defend these principles in the name of all the religions in this country. There's nothing in the Rukun Negara, its 5 aspirations and its 5 goals, which are antithetical to Islam. It's not just us saying it. The first people to say that in 1970 were actually PAS leaders. The deputy president of PAS at that time said as much, that the Rukun Negara is in line with Islam. But today, not a single PAS leader will say this, because again, the situation has changed. But people who know Islam know that there is nothing in the Rukun Negara that is against the universalism of Islam. And it's very much in line with Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity and all the other religions. It is inclusive, it is all-embracing. And for this multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, this is what we need. We cannot have an ideology which is somehow linked to only one segment of the national community. It'll be divisive, even if its content is universal. But the perception of that ideology will not be able to hold everyone together. This we must understand. This is why we need this. We will not be able to create another document like this, especially today because things are so divisive in our society. You will not be able to bring people together to forge a single unifying document. There's something that we have from the past, it's still alive, it's still there, and the groups that speak on behalf of it, and I must thank G25. G25 was one of the first groups that was willing to come out in support of the Rukun Negara. Thank you very much. And Dialogue Rakyat and a few other groups. So I think this is our struggle. This is our struggle. Individual issues are very important. Sectarianism, which Farid articulated so well, the issues pertaining to women's rights that Zainah talked about very eloquently, these things are very important. But all these things are related to this question. If the nature of our society changes and something else takes over, and that is installed, whether formally or informally, then I think everything else will be lost. So let us understand what is at stake. When we want to restore dignity to the Rukun Negara, empower it once again, and strengthen the Constitution, which again, as you know, is linked to the Rukun Negara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandra. I know I deliberately allowed you beyond your 10 minutes because you were sharing with us such a powerful message, and I can't think of the English word, mengimbau, imbauan, which I think all of us need because it concerns all of us. So, friends, I don't think we have that half an hour that I was hoping for. But between now and 5:43, I would like to give the last 2 minutes to the panelists if they have any last word to say. Can I call for comments? Yeah, Dato' Alimah.
I'm Halima from representing Voices of Peace, Conscience and Reason. Now, I'd like to be broad and important, but I think I would just like to comment on what Zainah has said and try to relate it a bit to Farid and Dr. Chandra. Right, I'm obsessed with the Farid issue because not only am I like a victim of this law, this rigid law, but I see it as being perpetuated down the line, down the generations of my family, right? Now, it's ironic because I grew up in a very democratic family. Both my mother and father were extremely open and democratic, but when they died, Farid was imposed upon me and my 5 sisters. and my brother as the male waris reigned, although in terms of the actual contribution to the family, I can say that my older sisters, did so much more than my brother ever did. Now, I'm very aware that any issues to do with Farid will point us back, Zainah, to the context in the Quran, where it is stated quite obviously that males inherit double, sons inherit double daughters. And it is this that people fear. There is this fear of confronting the issue. Although it stares at you in black and white, in figures, in proportion, double. All right, what is so controversial about that? Sons get double daughters. And some families take this very seriously. Although I know that many of my friends' families have resorted to other forms of managing the inheritance thing by having, sort of consultation, by sharing it equally on the outside and so on. But we went through Amanah Raya, yeah? And Amanah Raya, I think, is as chauvinistic as the Sharia courts, because they're managed by men, mainly. So if you think that Amanah Raya is going to be on your side when your father or your parents die, they're not. They will divide the property according to Farid. But they will advise you, boleh berbincang antara adik-beradik and so on, boleh. Tapi tak ada mechanism, yeah? So Zainah, I think we should look at a mechanism whereby Amanah Raya will be persuaded or compelled to go through this process of engagement or whatever, and actually counsel the members of the family, the siblings, on how to manage this seriously. Right? Now, I want to link that with the impact that it has on equality, the question of women's empowerment, equality, and so on. Because if women don't have their own resources, we are unequal. If we don't have economic resources to manage our lives and our families, we will remain at the women fancy of those fanciful husbands of ours. Not that mine is sometimes. All right? So I think to empower women, we need for them to have financial resources. And for Malay women, Muslim women, who are the least empowered, I think, right? Not only emotionally, but financially, they need the Farid to be on their side. Don't call it Farid anymore. I don't know what you can call it in your reform, but they must have an equal share. Then they can move forward equally. Now, to link it a little with what Farid said, Dr. Farid said about getting the rulers on our side, I'm not sure whether you meant what Zainah had said, or you were referring to Zainah's discussion, but what I'm just trying to contribute is that I think it's not going to work. Because the rulers are in this system which is parochial, which is, hierarchical. Adat and religion are in the picture. Adat and Islam are embroiled in this, the power of the rulers. So although they are head of the Islamic Council in the state, they will stand to be guided by the muftis and the ulamas and so on. So I'm not sure whether they are the right people. Now, to go back to, just to wind up with Dr. Chandra's idea of the constitution and the democracy and the equality and equity and whatever else is manifested in the constitution, I agree that is the place to go. At the same time as all these little nitty-gritties that we have to sort out, yeah, Zarina? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Datuk Narima. And then I come to you, the gentleman there.
Yes. Thank you. Prof. Chandra, So when we saw that Pancasila never got eroded as much as Rukun Negara did, and you gave your two hypotheses of why the erosion occurred, the ideological stand of Tun Mahathir and Anwar Ibrahim, and also his personal vendetta towards Ghazali Shafi'i. Is it then correct to say that Islam in Indonesia had never been used and abused as much as it has been in Malaysia for the sake of political ends? That means the political leaders in Indonesia never really had that ideological thing that was based on Islam to get votes. Am I right to make that conclusion? And I think also much as strong as Nahdlatul Islam and Muhammadiyah are in Indonesia, they are not political parties, unlike here we have political-based parties. Farid, is there any international move that maybe we in Malaysia can start to instigate the King of Jordan to have an Aman message, the second Aman message? I think we really, the whole world need to go back and look at the Aman message.
Yes.
Yes, panelists. My name is Jamie Teo, and I'm from Invoke. I came in late because I don't know about this program until my friend sent it to me. Okay, but I find it's very exciting, and all in all, I believe all we are concerned is how to get it done. So, in order to get it done, I think we need a political reform. So, if we discuss here, and the thing that I see is, if we do not get the political reform, we can't get what we want. I'm not sure you agree to me. And I believe, I also work now. I work for Invoke. I believe we all want a political reform. And we have to ask ourselves, how to get this reform? And what can we do? What can we do to make sure we guarantee get the reform? Guarantee, it must be guaranteed. It cannot be wishy-washy. And I believe, with all the good minds here, if we stay together and we brainstorm together, we sparring each other, we will get the solution that we want, the dream that we dream every day. We should be able to get it, and this is the best time. And here I would like to also, now I speak, just now I speak on behalf of myself, not from Invoke, okay? And now I want to speak on behalf of Bersih. Bersih is getting 100,000, trying to get 100,000 signatures, okay? I am working temporarily for Bersih. I got here, I need your help. The country needs your help. Please do something about it, and I hope after this, it is not, that's all. We should actually form something that brainstorm. And I believe, if you invite me to be one of them, I believe I can benefit you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I promise, yes, the gentleman. You want to ask? Yeah, I'll come to you. Yes, sorry, Dato', I didn't see you because of the camera. Okay, you are the third after.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Nick Najib, same name as the Prime Minister. I used to work in Saudi Arabia for 10 years. I would like to comment on Shiites. I have an Egyptian friend, and I asked him of what he feels, of what he thinks about Shiites. This is roughly what he said to me. When Rasulullah was alive, he was known as Prophet of Islam. Neither was he a prophet of Hanafi, Shafi'i, Hanbali, and what have you. And by the way, Rasulullah is not a Saudi, because Saudi Arabia was formed only in 1932. He was from Bani Quraysh. Now, the issue of Shiites and Sunni, to me, is a political issue. It's not a religious issue. It's also the role of the Western powers to divide and rule Muslims. By the way, also, Iran is known to discriminate against the Sunnis. It's not only the Sunnis discriminate against the Shiites. Lastly, about Wahhabism. Now we have a group, I call them a group of idiots. Aswaja. They condemn Wahhabism. I'm not Wahhabi. My question is, if you hate Wahhabi, why do you all go to Mecca and Medina and pray behind the Wahhabi imams and get buried in the Wahhabi cemeteries of Baqi and Ma'ala? Thank you.
Thank you. Quickly, yes. If you could keep your comments short, then I could take more people.
All right, it'll be very quick. My name is Daniel. I am a journalist, but I'm asking this in my own personal capacity today. Especially to Dr. Chandra, you've been speaking about the Rukun Negara and how it could help to unite and also bring equality to Malaysia. But I think this is a question that I find difficult to ask sometimes, but I'm sure that all of us here can be on the same page on this. Last year, the Rukun Negara was brought out in a very unusual scenario when a group of atheists gathered, and it gathered a lot of bad press. There was a statement from one of the MPs in the Dewan Rakyat that said that the freedom to choose a religion, the freedom of belief, does not mean freedom from belief. Now, the first principle of the Rukun Negara is belief in God. And I ask this because I know people who have chosen not to pick a faith. Therefore, would the Rukun Negara have an effect and also be unequal to those who do not choose a faith? Because the first principle is belief in God. So therefore, is that really, would the Rukun Negara really bring about complete equality with that in place? Thanks.
Thank you. Dato' Ramani?
Okay. Ramani Gurusamy, NCWO. Tan Sri Kangarusi, I first and foremost support all the recommendations put forward by Zainah Anwar, and let's support it, and let's find ways to support it. Secondly, I want to say that yes, we, the non-Muslims, so to say, women have come a long way. In the 60s, there were so many discriminatory practices, and that's why NCW was formed. And we were able to come together and address all the laws, legislations that discriminated against women. And I want to give you one example, which many of the older women here will know, and that is, even when we got married, we had to have a 1 day's break in service and became temporary teachers. All that we were able to put to right, but the Muslim women haven't moved very much. Even in 1994, when the Domestic Violence Act was passed, they said this doesn't apply to our Muslim sisters. And therefore, we said we will have nothing to do with it. After 2 years, in 1996, it came into being. It was implemented. So in the same way, Anwar, call you Anwar. Same way, Zainah, let's work together on this. Okay? It's sad to see you women being left behind. And it says now, no woman must be left behind.
Thank you. I'll take one last comment, Vanny. Yes.
Thank you, Bun. Referring to the point raised earlier by Daniel, I think if I may, clarify the situation a bit. We have to recognize that both the Constitution as well as the Rukun Negara are both important documents, but they have two different purposes because they are documents of different nature. The Constitution clearly is a very specific legal document that has a direct bearing on one's rights and entitlements and so on as citizens. But the Rukun Negara is not so much a legalistic document, but more of a declaration. But the declaration, like any declaration, is open to interpretation as well as misinterpretation, sometimes deliberate for vested interests, and can have a bearing on legalistic documents if it is taken out of context by whoever is in power. And I think the point that was raised is quite pertinent because, as you say, the first point concerning the Rukun Negara is belief in God, Tuhan, a single God, capital T, Tuhan. And for Muslims, I believe Allah is Tuhan, but Tuhan is not necessarily Allah. So we have a very mixed society in Malaysia, which is our strength. So I think when we have a situation where it doesn't just concern atheists, but also people of other communities, Taoists, Confucianists, Theravada Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, all do not have a single God. It's not just atheist. And in Hinduism, you've got not a single God, but several gods. So unfortunately, I find the Rukun Negara is not as inclusive as I would like. Because technically, it can be interpreted or misinterpreted by whoever is in power at some point in future to exclude communities. And we, the rest of us, have no power to counter that because we are not in a position of power. Yeah, so this is, I think, a concern. So I think if the Rukun Negara were to be worded differently in the first line, it would have been much more inclusive. But I don't know whether it can be revised to that extent. If it can, I think there would be no problem. So I think the danger lies in the potential for misinterpretation, for deliberate vested interest at some point in future if you're not careful. But it remains a good document if we take it in context and we know the limitations of it. And, promoting it is fine, but I think promoting the Constitution is even more important because it is of direct bearing to our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cik Bun. And thank you, all of you, for your very perceptive comments and questions. Now, if Tan Sri Alwi doesn't mind, we curi few minutes of your time. I would like to give the panelists a minute each to sum up. Please, who would like to start? Zainah?
Just a quick response. When it comes to Farid, it's always explicit in the Quran. You cannot change it. The figures are all there. It's pick and choose, right? There are so many things that are explicit in the Quran. Compassion, justice, kindness, men and women being each other's friend and protector. There are so many other values that are so wonderful in the Quran. And we say Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. We say all that every day, but we never translate that into action. But when it comes to Farid, oh my God, it's in the Quran. Never mind the injustice, never mind the discrimination, never mind the unfairness, we must stick to the Quran. Why? Why the Farid rule? Why not all these other values that are in the Quran? But anyway, in terms of this is why, like for the work of Sisters in Islam and the Musawat, the group that I now lead at the global level, understanding how knowledge is produced in the Muslim tradition is so important. How was knowledge produced? How were these fiqh rulings produced? What was the context? And the point is, and this is what we do in our training, these are all socially constructed understanding. It's not divine law. It's socially constructed. So the fact that daughters and sons inherit twice and husband inherit double, was within a context. In a context where women were not working, where there were extended families, there's always somebody to protect. And at a context when women at that time all over the world did not inherit a single thing. So actually, in the 7th century, that was progression. Yeah, and if we have been true to the teachings of Islam, the teachings of the Quran, the Muslims should be at the forefront of the feminist movement because Islam gave women many, many rights that did not exist But now the West have taken over, and suddenly all these rights are Western rights, and we have forgotten our own tradition. I mean, the point that I just want to make is that these are all interpretations connected to circumstances, connected to time periods, and that when circumstances change, times change, what is eternal is the principle of justice, the compassion. Those are the principles that should be guiding us in finding solutions, to the problems, that serious problems of injustice and oppression that we face today, that's keeping the Muslim community backwards. Just look at the unclaimed monies, billions of unclaimed monies, hectares of land, Muslim land that's unclaimed because of Farid. Doesn't anybody care about this, Anyway, I should stop there. But, the solutions can be found if we have the political will to find those solutions. But we don't have the political will. That's the problem.
Thank you, Zainah. Yes.
Just also to add to that, the problem is not everybody believes in contextual interpretation. So they will say that those verses that define the division of inheritance are not to be interpreted according to time and place, but are eternal, right? They hold for all times and all places. And that's a fun. So apart from the problem of administration, we also have the problem at the intellectual level, where there are different approaches. And if a certain approach is dominant, which is the case as far as Farid is concerned, you can't you can't bring about a change unless you have the power, unless you have the political power or the ability to persuade. So just a few issues that were raised with regard to myself. Somebody asked about the Aman message. Yeah, you did. We have tried. It's been difficult to Prince Ghazi. I contacted Prince Ghazi to ask him if the brother of King Abdullah, cousin or brother? No, same generation. Anyway, he's the actual drafter of the Aman message. So so far we've not been able to. I'm in correspondence with him, but we've not been able to get him to come. But certainly the idea of doing another Aman message, maybe without Prince Ghazi involved, is something that we should consider, especially today, because of the international climate today, as far as Sunni-Shiite conflict is concerned. But it will not be allowed to take place in Malaysia, because you need to get a tawliyah. We won't be able to get the tawliyah to do this. Yeah. Regarding, I think, was it also you, or no, somebody again, maybe it was you, who said the rulers would not be. But I think we have already seen some examples. Chandra mentioned the support that some of the rulers have given to Rukun Negara. We have seen at least 3 of the rulers from 3 states. They have weighed in on various issues. But it is sort of piecemeal. And I think one of the problems is that the rulers do not feel the weight of the rakyat behind them. And I think we as people have got to, to show them that we really need and depend on them. Because the fact is, the rulers, as far as the administration of Islam is concerned, the rulers have a role. It's enshrined in the constitution, and that's not going to go away. So the issue is, there are only 3 choices. They have a negative role to play, they have a positive role to play, or they are indifferent and they don't play the role that is given to them by the constitution. So there are only these 3 choices. Now, negative role is clearly out of the question, is not desirable. And them being indifferent and not playing the role given to them by the constitution is also not desirable. Therefore, the only choice we have is to urge them to play a role that would result in a more progressive administration of Islam. So I think it's our responsibility to urge them. Okay, on the Sunni Shiite issue, it was raised by the gentleman who was with the Egyptian friend. Look, Sunni Shiite, people need to be educated about this. You know, we don't have time to do it now. The difference between Sunnis and Shiites is not merely political. There are deep theological differences. There are differences in jurisprudence which are not so serious, but there are very serious theological differences which have implications for politics. But the point is, throughout Islamic history, there had never been a majority Sunni position that Shiites should be banned, that they're not allowed to practice. They're not allowed to lead their own lives and have their own systems of education and so on and so forth. There was never such a position taken by any Sunni community. There may have been individual Sunni scholars who were themselves in a minority, who took a minority position, but no Sunni government practiced such discrimination against Shiites. We have, in Malaysia, we have adopted that very, we are, my whole point is that the position we take against Shiites is contrary to Sunni tradition, right? Because we have a basic alienation from we are suffering from an alienation from our Sunni tradition. So we are not arguing that we should be liberal Muslims and allow Shiites to exist. By the standards of traditional Sunni Islam, what we're doing is wrong.
Thank you. Aston, you sure you don't want to use your 1 minute?
Just have 30 seconds. I echo whatever Dr. Syed Farid has said. You have to have this engagement with the Conference of Rulers, because there's really nothing quite higher than them on this matter of Islamic religious affairs. Politicians would like you to think, particularly during the Mahathir era, that it's this Jakim who has got the final say over everything. But in my opinion, I think it's quite fair to say that functions conferred on Jakim could arguably be unconstitutional as well. That has never been tried or challenged in court yet. Hopefully we'll do it someday. But that is the final apex, the rulers. There's nothing higher than that.
Thank you. Dr. Chandra.
I'd like to respond first to the question raised by our friend here and also Munagala. We have talked about this before here. There are three responses interrelated to queries that the two of you raised. Number one, if you look at the largest Muslim country in the world, Panchasila, first principle is belief in the oneness of God. Indonesia has always had atheists in their society. And some are very articulate atheists who have lived there for a long while. You have had Buddhists, you have had Confucianists, you have had Taoists, you have all these groups. You're right, these groups don't have a clear conception of God as such. But nonetheless, when the Panchasila was articulated and when it was propagated in such a vigorous manner in Indonesia, the objections didn't come from any of these groups. They saw it as something which they could live with. It was not a problem for them. It was not a problem for them because belief in God does not, as a philosophical belief, it does not exclude those who do not believe in God in terms of their citizenship rights, their rights as human beings. There's never been a single instance of an Indonesian with their 72-year history of Panchasila behind them, of an Indonesian being denied a job because he doesn't believe in God, or a Confucianist not being given a certain job because it is doubtful what his position is as far as the first principle of the Panchasila is concerned. So we have to see it in terms of realities of the sort. What has it meant to Indonesians who live under the Panji of the Panchasila, who live under the Payo of the Panchasila? Do they feel discriminated? Have they been discriminated? Has there been any instance? In fact, the challenge that Indonesia has faced for a long while in relation to religion is not vis-a-vis the first principle of the Panchasila. It has been largely the emergence of groups that have got a narrow interpretation of Islam, and in some instances, evangelical proselytizing interpretation of Christianity. Those are the issues that confront Indonesian society. So let us be real, look at the real situation. Now that is related to the second point, Boon and our friend here. In the council that produced the Rukun Negara, the question that you raised was already discussed and debated, because of the 69 members of the National Consultative Council, there were Buddhists, there were Confucianists, and this question of atheists and so on was raised. We look at the proceedings of the Panchasila, of the Rukun Negara, and they dealt with it in this manner, that it is not a belief which at the practical level would be an encumbrance upon any citizen in any way, and that was not the intention and would not be, and it has never been. Someone who supports the Panchasila can't say, oh, I believe in the Panchasila, therefore anyone who takes a contrary position should be punished, or for that matter the Rukun Negara. I believe in the Rukun Negara, so a person who takes a contrary position should be punished. That doesn't come into the picture at all. And the final and third very important point is this. The reason why it was put in there at that time, it was partly because of the context, but also there was a more permanent reason. The context was when you have 5 goals or aspirations of the Negara, and their goals linked to justice, you want to make it very clear, given the context at that time, that the fight for justice, the struggle for justice, is theistic and not atheistic. Why? Because of the communist factor at that time. That was articulated. One wanted to make a distinction, that you're not fighting for justice from a godless perspective. Now that is related to something which is more important and that is relevant today. The relevance of belief in God is to establish the spiritual, moral basis of society. That you're a society that is anchored, founded in a spiritual, moral basis. And it is the belief in the transcendent, and the transcendent is also linked to the sacred. It is that belief which provides the moral, spiritual basis to a society. If you remove that, then you become like any other society, which doesn't have that spiritual, moral basis. This is the reason why it is there. Thank you.
Very briefly, sorry. I'm just saying that the situation in Malaysia today is different from what it was when the Rukun Negara was first established in terms of the fusion of politics and religion, and it's also less liberal than Indonesia. So I think there are a number of examples that I know of, but we don't have time for that, but one of them at least I personally experienced affected me. So I'm very careful and wary of the possibilities of abuse of established principles.
Thank you.
Well, I want to respond very quickly to that. I think when we raise what I describe as red herrings of this sort, we won't go very far. The challenge before us today is the emergence and the strengthening of a very narrow approach towards Islam. That is the challenge. The challenge is not, atheists being excluded and all the rest of it. That is not the issue. The real issue is that issue. Let's concentrate on that issue and not bring in red herrings of this sort.
Thank you very much.
Red herrings, not really, because I have experienced that in a negative way when it was, targeted at me.
I think we'll have another forum on this issue. I know Dr. Chandra would have more, I think, from his...
No, because time doesn't permit, Chansri, otherwise, the other question,
yes.
I think someone had raised, if Chansri Alvi doesn't mind, if I can respond very quickly about Indonesia and the political parties there. I think it is so important to emphasize that Indonesia has had Islamic political parties too. The first election, 1955, we had 2 major Islamic parties that participated. But the very big difference, at least in relation to one of them, the Mashumi, they have a very enlightened approach to Islam, which you will never see in the case of PAS. This is the difference. And this is partly because of the whole tradition of Islam in public life in Indonesia that is different. And why this is so is a very complicated factor, and it takes time to explain this.
Thanks. This is one of my very favorite themes. So I strongly believe that there is a need for us to discuss more deeply and more widely on this issue, either auspices of G25 or Dr. Chandra's own outfit. I think we should keep this issue alive. Eh? So, yeah, maybe when. Thank you very much to the 4 panelists. I feel so gratified and so bernasib baik that I had this chance to moderate this session. I learned a lot, and I think, I hope that Dr. Narima and the others involved in the study got some of the clarification that we needed. Thank you very much, Aston, Zainah, Prof, and Dr. Chandra. Back to the juru acara. Thank you.